Hello, everyone. Welcome to Start the Week with Spencer. This is our weekly webinar here at Doman International, where we take questions from parents all around the world. And so if you are the parent of a child with special needs, we invite you to come with your biggest and most important questions, and we will do our very best to answer them. Now, today I'm going to be discussing what is the most important thing that you could start doing this year in 2026 with your child. And it's something that I think pretty remarkably is not something that requires any time preparation, any material preparation to start doing. It's something you could literally start doing today. So I think it's a very exciting conversation that we're going to be having. I'm going to be adding Colleen Hudson on. Hi, Colleen.
Hi, Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. Colleen is the first person at Doman International to speak to parents when they come to our organization. She's the director of our representatives. So welcome, Colleen.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Great. So yeah, let's get into what is the most important thing that you could start doing with your child in 2026. And the most important thing that you could start doing that you're not doing now is increase the number of words that you speak to your child with every day. So this is probably the most under-discussed phenomenon that I hear in parenting, which is children that grow up in homes where there is a large, sophisticated vocabulary being spoken to them have all kinds of lifelong benefits later on in life from that exposure, right? Essentially, the richer the linguistic environment that they're born into, the better it is for them long term. What they found when they track how parents and adults speak to children is that adults vary greatly in how much they speak to children, how many words they use, and the sophistication of their vocabulary. And this creates either great opportunities for the children or great challenges, depending on the amount of stimulation they receive. So some parents use as many as 30,000 words a day when speaking to their children, and other parents use as little as 3,000 words. So that is 10 times more. The parents who are most vocal, let's say, use 10 times more language than the parents who are least vocal. And what's pretty remarkable is over time, the children that are growing up in those rich linguistic environments where 30,000 words are being spoken a day have all kinds of benefits in terms of their education and even their long-term success in work. So just to give everyone an example, it's been shown that children that grow up in linguistically rich environments, for example, children who are growing up with 30,000 words spoken a day, when they are tested later on in life, will often have something like 10 to 15 higher IQ points than children who grow up in linguistically poor environments. Now, it's important for me to say, when I say linguistically rich or linguistically poor, I'm not talking about the amount of money the parents have. I mean, are parents speaking to children with a large vocabulary? Are they using sophisticated language? Are they talking to them throughout the day and explaining things to them? That's a linguistically rich environment. A linguistically poor environment would be a child who doesn't get spoken to a lot during the day. Maybe the child is spending a lot of time looking at a screen or on their own. They're not having people speak to them, explain things to them. That would be a linguistically poor environment. And again, there might be children who are growing up in a home which doesn't have a lot of money, but adults are speaking to them all the time and explaining things to them. They might even be growing up in homes that are multilingual with multiple languages being spoken. So it's a linguistically rich environment. Other children who might be growing up in very rich households, might be sitting on screens all day, right? And not have a lot of time with their parents. So that's what I mean when I say linguistically rich and linguistically poor. And so in this session, I wanted to talk about what are some things that parents can do to greatly increase the number of words that they are using in a day with their children. And this is something which is important both for parents of children with special needs and parents of children who are well and neurotypical, right? Both of these groups of children need a lot of language in their environment to develop both their understanding and their speech development. So yeah, today we're going to be talking about what are some kind of common sense things you could start doing right now to help your child grow linguistically. Now, while we're talking about the benefits of growing up in a linguistically rich environment, I should also say that the way children are spoken to doesn't just affect their cognitive development and their speech development, it also impacts the way they look at themselves and the way they look at themselves, and it might even impact their self-image, right? Or how they feel their relationships are with the people around them, right? Children that grow up who are spoken to in a sophisticated and respectful way, right, where they feel like they're being addressed by their parents in a respectful way, are much more likely to behave in a more mature way, right? Because they see themselves inherently as being respected, they have more respect for themselves. They tend to be more mature and have more respect for other people in their environment. On the other hand, children who are often spoken down to, children who are, maybe there's a lot of baby talk in the house, they're kind of talked down to, they're not explained things, they're much more likely to behave in babyish ways, right? If you're spoken to in a babyish way, you'll think of yourself as a baby. And so I think especially when we look at children with special needs who tend to be less vocal than other children get spoken to a lot less than other children, right? Because many adults aren't sure how much the child understands, so they're less likely to explain things. The child isn't vocal themselves, and so the parent is less likely to engage the child, knowing that it might be difficult for the child to speak back what they're thinking. And so for children with special needs, the number of words that they're often hearing in a day is greatly reduced. And so it's even more important for those children that they grow up in a linguistically rich environment where they're hearing a lot of language during the day. Colleen, before I start to jump into, some recommendations that I have for parents, you've had an opportunity to grow up with you grew up on our program, and you've also seen a lot of children who grew up with parents who knew about the Doman Method and interacted with their children in different ways. Mm-hmm. Any thoughts that you have on how children might change based on how they're spoken to?
Oh, for sure. I think even when I was raising my own daughter, she's 21 now, she's more or less raised. But when she was small, people would sometimes comment on the way that I would be explaining things to her as we were going along, at an appropriate level. I wasn't getting in deep about how I was balancing my checkbook or whatever, but I would, I would explain to her, we're going to the bank because I have to put some money in because I got to pay a bill, or whatever it was. And people would comment on that, like, oh, why are you explaining these things to her? She's not going to get them. And I would say, well, eventually she will. And I remember in my own life, because I learned to read very young, my parents are talkers. They're big talkers. So they were always explaining things to us. And then, of course, they had the Doman Method as a framework. So it was like off to the races. You should be explaining everything to your kids, which is your natural instinct anyway. But when I was reading independently, there were many, many times where I would read a word that I did not know anything about. I didn't know what that word meant. And before I was old enough to know how to really use a dictionary, I would read the word. Maybe I would be reading it correctly in my, pronouncing it correctly in my head, maybe not. But then often later on, that word would come up and I would say, oh, that's what that is. So you're storing things away without even realizing it. And so I think about that verbally when we're talking to our kids. No, they're not going to understand why we need to go to the bank to put money in to pay a bill. But if you're telling them these things, you're setting up a good framework for ongoing conversation. I will say all through the teenage years, and even now, a conversation is the default, and for me to update my daughter on the things that we're doing is the default. It's natural. And then she'll tell me. I mean, she's a little less loquacious than I am because she's, doing her own thing. But that's just what we do, is communicate about, we're doing this, we're doing that. And it isn't all minutia. A lot of times it's, oh my gosh, I read this book and it really made me feel this way about something. So it builds a relationship there too, where you're not just going on about your normal things in the day. It's that, but it's also, let's share stuff that's deeper now as you age and level up in your understanding. So yeah, so I can say that even though people would say, oh, why are you explaining that to her? Or why are you using those big words?
Yeah.
What? And I remember in the reading lecture, why did we make the words short? Is it because the kids are short?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Why should, cat, hat, mat, sat be any more important than spaghetti or, or
Exactly.
anaconda or whatever, things that are, words that are, interesting and just as useful. So.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's go through I actually have 10 recommendations to run through on how could you, if I was speaking to a parent and a parent only used, like I said, 3,000 words in a day, and they said, hey, Spencer, how would I go from 3,000 to that goal of 30,000 words? What are some of the things that I could do? So here are 10 recommendations that I have for you. Okay, so number one, I would recommend to label people, places, and things in the environment. Describe them in specificity, right? So one very easy way, especially with a young child or with a child who's not very verbal, to just talk to them more is tell them what things are. So I recently visited a friend, and the friend has a 10-month-old, and the 10-month-old wanted to interact with me. And so I picked him up and I just started to walk around the house and started telling him what things were. So I'd say, oh, look at that painting. Oh, do you see the soldiers in the painting? And look, there's a tree, right? And then we'd walk over somewhere else and I'd say, do you see the lamp? Oh, let's turn on the lamp. Let's turn the switch on. Oh, look at that. Now the light bulb is turned on. So one of the easiest things to do, and it requires almost no creativity, is labeling. Right? Many parents do this instinctually, right? They go on walks with their children and they just tell them what things are. Oh, look at the dog across the street. Wow, do you see the clouds? Look how beautiful they are. Look at the car. Now, I mentioned there, describe them in specificity. The more specific you can be, the better, right? So, maybe one easy example is to say, instead of saying, look at the dog, if you can be more specific and say, look at the Siberian Husky, even better, right? The more specific you can be, the better, right? And listen, be as specific as you feel comfortable being specific. If you're not sure of something, that's okay, but the more specific you are, it means you'll most likely be using more sophisticated language, right? For example, if you look at children's books at a 5-year-old level, they're not very specific. They'll say, Dick and Jane walk to the park, right? The elephant is big. Those are the kinds of sentences you'll see in a book for a young child. But as a child gets older, the sentences become longer, richer, and more specific. So, but this is one of the best things, especially with a child who doesn't talk a lot. Walk around and label things with them. Tell them what they are. And by the way, that 10-month-old, I picked him up and he was just riveted, right? I just walked around and described things in the room. Sometimes he was even crying. And as soon as I started labeling things, he stopped crying because he was like, oh, this is interesting, something for us to do. And then when I visited them again, as soon as I walked in the door, he was like, hey, you crazy person who talks to me, come back, right? Kids will remember the people who talk to them. And so immediately he would recognize me and say, pick me up, bring me around, tell me things. So it's a very simple thing to do. It's very underutilized with children. It's a great way also, by the way, getting maybe a little philosophical here, of helping children become more both aware of their surroundings, right? And also, and that puts them more at ease. I think that it's if we're talking about philosophy, this might sound a little woo-woo. It helps children become present, right? So, for example, sometimes when a child is crying, they might even be upset, and they may not even fully be aware why they're upset. They might, maybe they're bored, but they're some and any parent of a toddler knows that sometimes a child will start crying because they're upset about something. And now all of a sudden they're crying and it has nothing to do with even the original thing in the first place. And very often, if you pick up a child and you just start telling them about things, that crying child will settle because it's like, oh, okay, now we're kind of back into the present moment. We're talking about things around us. Got it. So I've found it to be a helpful thing when children are upset as well. Okay, the second thing, which is similar to labeling things, is just describing events as they're happening, right? So you're in the grocery store with the child, and you're saying, "Hey, remember, Dad loves, his popcorn. So let's make sure to go to aisle 6 and pick up the popcorn for Dad. No, we have to get the unsalted because, Dad, for his health, he can't have the salted popcorn," right? You're literally describing what you might be thinking, right? But you're telling your child. It's a great way to increase the number of words your child is hearing, and also, helping your child understand sophisticated reasons for why things are happening, right? And that can be very helpful, especially for a child in an unknown environment where they might be uncomfortable, they might be uncertain about what's going on, and having someone there to narrate you and tell you what's going on really puts you at ease. I don't know if you've ever been in a situation before, like I go to other countries, right, very often for work. And I can't tell you how helpful it is when I was in India and there was a festival, it was very loud, and having an Indian friend next to me saying, "Oh, this is why they're doing this, and this is why this is a great, oh, got it, that makes sense." So it's always helpful to have that kind of friend telling you what's going on, and it's a great way to improve your child's cognitive development and make them more aware of their surroundings. All right, the next thing, and by the way, this third thing I had completely forgotten about until a mom on social media made a post about it. She had read my grandfather's books, and she said she does this with her child every day, and it's her favorite thing she learned from Glenn Doman. I had completely forgotten that he recommended this. So he recommended to give 3 more facts when answering questions than you would have otherwise, right? So if your child, asks you, "Where are we going right now?" Right? You could say, we're going to the doctor, right? That's a honest answer, but you could also give more information, 3 more facts than you would otherwise, right? So you say, "Oh, we're going to the doctor, okay, because Mom had a blood test." So there's one fact, right? And the blood test showed, high levels of T3, so Mom's going to get her thyroid checked out, right? Something like that. So I'm not saying that you need to scare your child, but giving 3 more pieces of information is a really good way of, again, introducing your child to more sophisticated concepts and really helping them understand things on a deeper level. Okay. And by the way, sometimes, children will even ask brilliant questions. They'll ask questions like, "Why is the sky blue?" And adults don't know the answer to it. So they'll kind of say, "Because it is," or, whatever, or they'll avoid the question. And in those moments, by the way, it's perfectly fine to say to your child, "That is a great question, and I don't know the answer. Why don't we look that up when we get home? Like, let's find out the answer together." I love that because it shows children that curiosity is a good thing, that it's really important to, when you don't understand something, ask a question, and then let's go through the work and finding the answer. What a great thing to teach a kid. But yeah, when your child asks you a question, or even when you're just explaining to your child, try to give 3 more facts than you would otherwise. It's a great way of building your child's cognition and understanding.
Can I tell a quick anecdote? Because
Yeah,
you said, why
please.
is the sky blue?
Yeah.
My brother John was known as the why kid. Everything was why. I mean, he was endlessly curious, which was great. And he had asked about the blue sky, and he had exhausted all of my father's knowledge about the blue sky, but he kept asking questions. So my dad said, John, I gotta read more about this. I'm gonna look this up. Now this was back in like 1982 or whatever. So he's like, I'm gonna read more about it and we'll talk about it tomorrow. And my brother's okay. So my dad read, got to the encyclopedia and read all about the blue sky, and he had all of the answers to the questions. The next day he said, Johnny, remember when you asked about this with the sky and that? He explained it. And my brother said, oh, what about this? And my dad said, oh, I looked that up too. And da, da, da. So at the end of this, my father's thinking, this is great. We've done all the things. And my brother looks at him and he says, but how do you know? Because he was that kind of kid.
Yeah. Yeah, no.
So be prepared.
Be prepared. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, because my father, because I'm tired, because I read it. He's like, but how do they know?
Well, Colleen, it's funny because I heard someone speaking yesterday. It was like a podcast, but they were mentioning, now this is not a diagnosis. They made up this term, but they said that they feel like today many people suffer from curiosity deficit disorder. Like there's not enough curiosity, where people want to learn about something or want to know about something. And so they termed it curiosity deficit disorder. But what I can tell you is, like, if you follow these recommendations, not only will it be great for improving your child's cognition, it's going to help raise a much more curious child, right? Because the truth is, the more information you have, the more curious you become about things, right? Because usually, to the point about your brother, Colleen, the truth is, the more we learn, the more we kind of realize how little we understand, and it usually raises more questions, and sometimes you'll be around someone who never questions anything. They just go with the flow, and they never like inquire more about things, and it becomes clear, like, oh, it's important sometimes to question why things are the way they are.
Yes, exactly.
Well, my grandfather also always used to say his definition of a genius. So this was Glenn Doman's definition of a genius is someone who sees the way things are and the way they ought to be, and then they move the world in the direction of the way the things ought to be, right? So it's not just about being smart, it's about understanding how are we going to get from here to this better place and actually putting that into place. That's what a genius is. And so I think that speaking to children in this way is much more likely to unleash that innate genius that children have in them. Well, my next recommendation is really 2 different points, but they're just, again, good ways to increase your child's cognition and the number of words you speak to your child, and that is recap past experiences and prepare your child for the future, right? So one great thing is, I actually just brought 3 nephews to a museum, right? I brought them to a museum in Philadelphia called the Museum of Illusions, and there are a lot of visual illusions. And at the end, I just like to ask questions. What was your favorite thing that we did? What did you think about this? Why did this thing create a visual illusion for us? And so now with a child who's verbal, you can ask them questions, and that's helpful for them to talk about their own experiences. But even for a child who's not verbal, you can recap past experiences. You could say, wasn't that great? At Christmas, we went to grandma's house, and did you notice Aunt Nancy was there? And then you played with Uncle John, and he's so much fun, isn't he? He kept throwing you up in the air. So you just recap the experience. It's a great way for your child to recall what, and also hear what their experiences are in language, because it was their experience, right? It's already internalized. What you're doing is you're verbalizing what their experience was. Very good for their comprehension and speech development. Preparing your child for the future is such a great way to help a child adapt to something that's going to happen. We one really good example of this is many children who are raised on the Doman Method, for example, before they go to a museum with their parents, they'll often be shown what they're going to see in the museum before they go. So if there are paintings, they might be shown, Doman cards with pictures of the paintings. And what we found is when a child is prepared in that way, they go to the museum and all of a sudden they're entranced, right? Adults will just like walk through the museum like, oh, okay, nice painting by Picasso, who cares? And meanwhile, you'll see like a 6-year-old who's completely enthralled with it. My mom keeps reminding me that the first time I ever saw the Tower of Pisa, because she had shown me what it was before we went and she told me about it, when I saw it for the first time, I said, look, it's my tower. So I said that at 3, right? The 3-year-old mind was, I have a picture of this tower in my house. It's my tower, and but it shows you the power of, talk to your children about what they're going to experience, where you're going, what are you going to do when you're there? Why are you doing it? These are really good ways. And by the way, children will, their behavior will completely change when they've been adequately prepared for something.
I once told a museum docent that we had pre-gamed the museum because it was a class trip that was coming up. But I had talked to Olivia about what we were going to see, what the museum was going to cover, all of these things, because I knew that was a more enriched experience. And then when we were there, the docent said, oh, she's really engaged and very interested in this. And I said, oh, yeah, we pre-gamed. I said, we read a whole book about it and we've learned all it would be cut before we got here. She said, oh.
Yeah, and Colleen and I used to teach children who had been raised on our program, and we'd bring them on field trips to local places in Philadelphia, like historic houses or museums. And very often the docents would say to us, like, what did you do with these kids? Like, they ask really good questions, they know what they're talking about, children who are prepared act completely differently and they appreciate things so much more. And by the way, as I think almost every parent will be able to resonate with this, when you bring your child on an experience and they appreciate it, it's a beautiful bonding experience for parent and child together. But if you've ever brought your child to something important and they didn't appreciate it, it can be tough. It's upsetting. You're saying, oh, this is a great movie or this is a great museum, and you're not getting any enjoyment out of it. If you prepare them for it, they are far, far more likely to really appreciate it. All right, the next point, again, for everyone who's joining late, we're talking about how do you increase your daily vocabulary from 3,000 words a day up to 30,000 words a day, that's the number of words the parents who speak the most to their children speak 30,000 words a day. By the way, I didn't mention this earlier, that not only do children who grow up in linguistically rich environments tend to have higher IQs. I'm not saying that IQ tests are the best way of measuring intelligence, but they're, I guess, a way. 10 to 15 points higher, but also increases in intelligence like that also connected with things like how likely is the person to get an advanced degree in university? How high paying is their job? So these are things that, now I wouldn't say to you, the only reason you should speak to your child more words is so that they get a higher paying job. I'm much more interested in raising a child who is, bright and interested in the world around them. That's why I would do it. But there are other very positive repercussions from all of this. Well, the next point is read a book to your child, not baby books, and also constantly read them new content. Reading a book is a great way to introduce vocabulary to your child that you don't get to use on a daily basis. And by the way, even some books use, kind of made up words, but even those can be stimulating to a child just to get them thinking in a way. I'm thinking about like a Dr. Seuss book, for example. At least it'll get the child thinking in a different way than they would otherwise. So read a book to your child, but not baby books. And baby books, you know what they are when you see them, right? Sometimes they use baby language. Sometimes there's very little language, right? If you open a book and there's not a lot of text, like there's not a lot of information, it's probably a baby book. Sometimes parents will misunderstand me and think that I'm saying you should never have one of these books in your home, or they'll see that I'm recommending constantly new content, and they think I can never reread a book to my child. I'm not saying that, of course. Actually, children benefit from frequency, and many children want the same books read to them again and again. So that's not a problem. It's only a problem when that's the only thing that's happening. Some parents will tell me, oh, I've got 2 books for my child. They're the only things he wants me to read, and then I just read those 2 books all the time. Okay, well, then your child is really just, their linguistic environment is being limited now because they're only getting 2 books instead of 50, right? So you want to constantly be introducing new content. You can still keep favorite books around, but reading is a great way to keep introducing new vocabulary to your child. And by the way, I would recommend both fiction, stories, novels, and nonfiction, informational books, because they use very different language. They talk about different concepts and different ideas. Colleen?
I found that the books that wanted to be read over and over and over again were at bedtime, and we kind of purposely kept those in her bedroom. So those were the bedtime books, and she would always pick one of like 3. But throughout the rest of the day, we would be going to the library, or I'd always have new books in the living room, a couple new books in the kitchen, just things that we could drop, a couple new in the car. I have stacks and stacks and stacks of books all the time, and shelves of books. So that was a natural thing, but it helped to kind of separate the space. So the reading again books were the bedtime books. Yeah, there were a couple books. It's like, oh no, please no more. But you try to hide them, and they're like, no, they know.
Yeah, exactly. And definitely when a child's doing a bedtime routine, you want routine, right? And so sometimes something that's too exciting can not be good for sleep. So yeah, I agree with you. The last book you read before sleep, probably that would be the best one for it to be a repetitive one. By the way, we're getting a lot of great comments and questions. I'll get to them. I'm still going through. I've got a few more recommendations for increasing your speaking vocabulary with your children. So let's get to the next one. The next one that I have that is a little bit of a repetitive one with the first one, because I discussed this a bit, is just speak as specifically as possible with your child. Okay. So I use this example of look at the Siberian Husky rather than look at the doggy, right? My aunt, I heard her talk about this often, where she said that, if a child gets hurt and you say, oh, look, you got a boo-boo, right? That's very, she said, if you say that, the child will cry, oh, I've got a boo-boo, and those children, I notice they'll often walk around and say, look, I got a boo-boo, look, I got a boo-boo. But she would say to the child, oh, look, you have a laceration. So she'd use whatever the medically correct term was. So a laceration is the word for a cut. Or if the child had a bruise, she'd say, oh, look, you have a contusion, And she said that when she would do that, the child would go, oh, okay, I have a contusion, fine, And the reason why I think that this is a powerful thing, first of all, the more specificity you use, the wider vocabulary you use, right? And that's very good for increasing a child's vocabulary. And this is just something I'm just going to quickly remark on because it's not the main point of all this, but words also have different connotations, right? Meaning that even words that might mean the same thing, we interpret in different ways. And there's a whole field of study on this called neuro-linguistic programming. So just to give you an example, if you think in your head, oh, I've got a problem, right? Oh, this is such a problem. That's very different from saying, oh, this is a challenge, right? Now, problem and challenge, pretty similar in meaning, but the way we interpret it is very different, right? So when a child hears contusion and boo-boo, like boo-boo sounds, oh, it sounds sad, it sounds bad. Contusion, oh, it sounds kind of medical, got it, not a big deal. So it's very scientific, right? So words have connotations, and that does have an impact on the way we think. And I also like to say to parents, this is another good reason to give the child a wide vocabulary, because it changes the way we think, right? I'll sometimes in my life, let me go back to that example of problem, right? Sometimes we might use the word problem. Other times we might use the word issue. Oh, I've got an issue. Other times we might use the word challenge. But when a person knows these different words have different connotations, they are more likely to select the word that is best for that moment, right? So the way they communicate with people becomes much better, right? Instead of walking into a room and saying, guys, we have a problem, they say, hey, guys, we've got an issue we need to work on. Or, you know what, everyone, I've got a challenge for us to work on. It's a different way of thinking. And the wider a vocabulary a person has, I think it's powerful for thinking in more strategic ways. Well, this leads to the next point, which is to use synonyms to increase your child's vocabulary. So instead of always saying, that's big, you could say, hey, that's enormous, or that's huge, or that's gigantic, or that's humongous, or that's colossal, right? These are all synonyms. They all mean the same thing. But for some people, they might only know the word big, right? Because that's all they were ever exposed to. For a child who grows up in an environment where they're hearing all of these terms, their vocabulary is going to be much, much richer, right? For parents who are using 30,000 words a day, they're probably using a lot of synonyms throughout the day. And that's a great way of growing vocabulary. I remember when I took the GRE, which is the test that everyone needs to take to go for a master's or a PhD program in the US. I remember I really wanted to focus on math. So I focused a lot of my prep for the test in math because I felt more confident that with the English portion, because there's an English test, I felt more confident in it. I think because of the early exposure I had received I grew up very lucky. My grandparents, my parents, my aunt used very large speaking vocabularies. And I think that really helped me. I also read a lot as a child. That also helps. And when I took the GRE, not really having studied for the English portion, I scored in the top 3%. And I was kind of astonished because I hadn't really even tried. But I think a lot of that has to do with, again, that's not me bragging. It really has to do with the amount of language that I was exposed to as a child. And so that's why I think it's so important for all kids to get this huge advantage. All right. The next thing I wanted to say, again, we're talking about ways you can have a larger speaking vocabulary with your child for their cognition and speech development. Tell your child about something you learned. I don't have a child, so I end up doing this a lot with my wife. So I read something or I listen to a podcast and I say, hey, Melissa, let me tell you about this. And sometimes I'll even say to her, Melissa, you really need to listen to this podcast. And she'll say, no, you'll just tell me all the most important things. Thank you very much. But there are kind of two sides to this. First of all, of course, it's going to be very beneficial for your child. You've learned something new. You're excited about it, right? Tell your child about it. And it's a great way for your child to learn, especially if it's something you're interested in. They'll pick up on that, right? If most people who love watching football had a parent who watched football, right? We learn to be interested and love things often from the interest of our parents and other family members. So it's a great way to increase your child's knowledge and interest on things that you're interested in. But I do have to say, on the other side of it, as the person speaking, you will learn from the experience of explaining things. Once someone told me that you really don't understand something. You don't truly understand it until you can explain it to someone else and they can understand it. That means you really get it. And so it's a great way for you also to learn from the experience, because you're going to be teaching your child. And there might be things where you realize, oh, I don't know how to explain this to my child. Let me find out the answer to that, and I'll come back to them later on and explain it to them. So tell your child about something you learned. It's a great way to increase your child's interest in things. All right, I think this is my last one. And it's a pretty simple one that many parents do instinctually, and that's tell your child a story. We all know stories, books that we read as kids. Sometimes it might be a story about a hero that you have or someone important. It could be a story from your family or an experience that you had when you were a child, right? So it could be a story that is fictional, or it could be a story of something that actually happened. But tell your child the story. It's a great way to introduce new ideas to your child. And it's, again, this is something you can do for a child who's even nonverbal, right? If a child can't speak, you can still tell them a story. So it's a great way, again, to stimulate your child regardless of their age. Yeah, and just maybe recapping the thing, most of the things that we've talked about today, your child doesn't have to speak to do these things, right? Like describe events as they're happening. Your child doesn't have to talk for you to describe events. Labeling things as you walk around, child doesn't have to talk. So many of these things, recapping past experiences, preparing your child for the future, children don't have to talk. So these are all things that you can start even with babies. And in fact, I would highly recommend that you do so. Even in the first 9 months of life, the baby's brain is just constantly searching the environment for what do I need to understand. The brain is constantly, searching. And so it's a great, great time to just start talking to your child. All right, let's start to get to some comments and questions that we've received. So Annabella said, we often don't talk to our special needs children because we believe they don't understand because they don't speak, and they are desperate for more information. Exactly right. Exactly right. They are desperate for more information. They need more information, and they're often not given it, right? And there's two sides, I think two different challenges here, Annabella, that are a bit connected. The first is, well, it's a little harder to talk to someone when you may not get a verbal answer. Now, what we do with the Doman method is we do use things like the choice board, different and facilitated communication and typing and writing, different ways that children can communicate with us besides speech, and that's really good, while the program is helping their speech development. So that's the first thing. It is a little harder to speak to a child who has no speech or limited speech. I'll admit that, just like, I spent a lot of time with children who have special needs and have limited speech. It's harder. But again, tell them a story, read them a book, prepare them for something. These are all things that even a child with limited speech. And then the other side of this is some people are fearful the child won't understand, right? This fear of, I don't think my kid will understand what I'm explaining, and so what's the point? And what I would say to that, first of all, a little tongue in cheek, is that, well, your child will definitely not understand it if you don't explain it to them, right? So that's the most important thing. Explain it. They hopefully will get it. They may not, but you have nothing to lose by explaining something to your child. But also that even children, understanding is an auditory ability, right? Or it's our ability to hear speech and understand it. It's a completely different ability than the ability to speak, which is a motor capability, right? It's our brain's ability to send messages to our mouth. There are many people who are able to understand everything that's said to them, and they can't speak. So don't make sure to not, now I'm not speaking to you, Annabella, but I'm saying to all the other parents, make sure not to confuse comprehension and speech development. Ashley is saying, yes, anywhere we go on field trips, we constantly get comments on how interested our children are. Yeah. And I'm sure, Ashley, the great thing is, I talked about preparing children for things. That's great. But obviously, if children have grown up in a home where they're constantly explained things and prepared for things in advance, they reach a certain point in their maturity where even if you throw them into an environment no one has prepared them for, they're already more curious, because they have so much more information than maybe other children would have. Now they're just intuitively interested in new things, and they're because they've grown up in a home where asking questions is not just acceptable, it's appreciated. They're much more likely to do it in outside places, outside environments. All right, we've got a question here from Ella. Ella says, Happy New Year to you both. I have a technical question. As the mother of a 4-month-old with Down syndrome, I went to a mandatory appointment this morning with a physiotherapist who told me that whatever the intensity and quantity of stimulation I provide my child with, it will not make him quicker. He will always be slow. As a brain specialist, do you agree with that? What can he expect to gain with the method, just knowledge, or an improvement in quickness of thought? Thank you so much for your insight. Very good question. So Ella, I could not disagree more with what that physiotherapist said to you. Okay. And if you were sitting in my office at the Doman International Clinic, I'd probably say, maybe this person isn't the right person to be working with your child. I know that's a very dramatic thing to say, but and very judgmental on my part, but I'm really unimpressed with what the person said, because I think that even most professionals would probably at this point disagree. I think we've been able to make enough headway over the last 70 years that most professionals would understand that children that grow up in environments that are stimulating, that they're going to somewhat get some benefit out of it. They may not appreciate the full capabilities of children. In fact, they usually don't, but I think most professionals would even recognize that. So I greatly disagree with what he told you. And in fact, I think it's a destructive thing to tell a parent, because many parents will take that advice at face value and just say, okay, what's the point of really trying to stimulate my kid if he's not going to get it? What I would also say, this is not what I'm saying to you, Ella, it's what I would tell you, the physiotherapist. I'd say, okay, if giving a child more stimulation isn't helpful, does that mean denying stimulation isn't harmful? In other words, if we take a child and we don't stimulate them at all, would that be harmful? And assuming that he's, I'm trying to be nice here, assuming he has some understanding of how the world works, he would probably say, oh no, denying stimulation to a child isn't healthy, right? Like, we're not going to speak to this child, right? Unfortunately, there have been terrible, people who have, put children in basements their entire childhood. We know what happens to those children. They don't develop understanding, they don't speak, right? So denying stimulation is very harmful. But then it would be very bizarre where denying stimulation is harmful, but then giving more stimulation doesn't make any difference, right? And what we know from experience is that giving children stimulation with frequency and intensity and duration is incredibly productive. It's very helpful. It helps them in their cognition, it helps them with their speech development. And that's what I really want parents to take away from this session, that even just the way you talk to your child can make a lifelong difference. And so, Ella, just to give you an example, with a 4-month-old, with the Doman method, we will start with a lot of sensory stimulation, visual stimulation, auditory stimulation, tactile stimulation, because the sensory pathways are our learning pathways, right? Your 4-month-old is learning from the world through the sensory pathways. So we do visual, tactile, auditory stimulation to improve the baby's ability to see, hear, and feel. And then what we start to do over time, Ella, is start to teach children remarkable things. We teach children with Down syndrome to read. well before their school age. We teach them math, we teach them writing. But a lot of that starts with just the belief that a child has innate intelligence. The reason why, if I was a professional who agreed with your physiotherapist, and I just took that at face value, oh, children receive stimulation and, it makes no difference in the long run. If I had that mindset, I never come up with a single answer for any child my entire life, because I've already set a ceiling, which is harmful. And that's why I don't quite understand professionals who don't believe that children have innate abilities beyond what they're able to do at the moment. It'd kind of be like, would you ever want to send your child to a teacher who said, I don't think children can learn? Okay. I'll find another teacher who does. Thank you very much. So I really, really disagree with this person. And in fact, to be a bit more straightforward, I know it's wrong because I see it every day, where when children are given a daily program of stimulation that is helping their brain development, they do change, and in ways that are very obvious and visible to parents. Colleen, anything you want to add to that?
Absolutely. I just wanted to let you know, Ella has a crawling track. The baby has 2 older siblings. Yeah, they're going to come and see us in
Perfect.
Probably later in the year. But I'm just appalled. I'm just appalled, honestly. And Spencer, correct me if I'm wrong, but do we not have graduates of our program with a Down syndrome diagnosis who have gone on to earn advanced degrees because they wanted them?
Degrees, absolutely.
Yeah. So, that didn't happen by accident. It's because
who have jobs, who live independent lives, who are married. We have graduates with Down syndrome who have achieved, I think the life goals that most neurotypical people have, So yeah, absolutely. And what a destructive thing to say. I mean, it's just to say that to someone. Just from an emotional standpoint, it's crushing to parents to hear that. I mean, that alone is bad enough, but it's just factually inaccurate, and it's very harmful to children. It's very harmful. Yeah. You're in the right place, Ella. Okay. Virginia says, Happy New Year, Dr. Spencer and Madam Colleen. I differ with you unless you are talking about regular children without special needs, because children with disability, especially autism, needs clear instructions. Am I lost? Really good question. So let me say something here, Virginia, and 2 different things.
She does follow up a little bit, or do you mean there's a, yeah.
Oh, sorry, I missed that one. Okay. Or you mean we use more descriptive words? Oh, look at this cow. Then you add, it has 2 eyes and a tail. See the legs. A cow has 4 legs. Is that what you mean? So yes, Virginia, in many ways, that is what I mean. So, for example, I gave the example of giving 3 pieces of information more than you might otherwise. So you gave an example of that, right? It's one thing to say that's a cow, but it's another thing to say, oh, look at the cow. The cow lives on a farm. And it has 2 eyes and 4 legs and a tail. And look, it has udders, and udders is where milk comes from, and many people drink milk, right? So you could give a lot of information about a cow, much more than just saying it's a cow. So yes, but Virginia, everything that I said, I meant for parents of neurotypical kids and parents of children with special needs. And in fact, I'd probably argue it's even more important for children with special needs, because they need a large vocabulary in their environment. And I'd like to maybe just explain one thing, Virginia. You talk about clear instructions. You are correct, right? It is important to give children clear instructions that they can follow. And for many children with, you mentioned an autism diagnosis, sometimes they have challenges with organization, which means if you speak to them you give them 10 instructions in a row, it can be very difficult for them to organize that information. Okay. And so if you watched how I evaluate a child, right, with autism in our clinic, you would probably see me when I want them to do something. I tend to give very clear instructions. I'd say, okay, get down on the ground and let's creep, or I'd say, where's the word banana, right? So my instructions are clear. But by the way, also, if I'm telling a neurotypical child what to do, I also try to use very clear, concise instructions. But that doesn't mean that when I'm speaking to the child throughout the day, I wouldn't use a large speaking vocabulary. Because again, if you're limiting how much you're speaking to your child because of an autism diagnosis and using very short sentences and not giving a lot of information, that is not going to help your child's understanding develop, right? Your child's comprehension will only develop when they're introduced to new things, right? So for example, if you take a 2-year-old and they spend all of their time with other 2-year-olds, right? They would only develop the speech of a 2-year-old, right? Because they've never heard what a more sophisticated speaking vocabulary is like, right? 2-year-olds together aren't going to develop their own speech, right? So it's really, so children learn more speech by hearing new linguistic things in their environment. So yeah, very, very important to use a large speaking vocabulary with your child. All right. Let's see what else we've got here. Oh, we've got a comment here from Amelia who says, "You are great, doing an amazing job. You gave me hope and really helped my son. Thank you." Oh, wonderful, Amelia. Thank you so much. That's great. I've got another comment here on Instagram from Primal Vinyasa, who says, "Yes, we are shaping their brain. Every warm word, every clear sentence, every moment of being spoken to instead of talked about activates neural pathways for language, regulation, and connection." Yeah, what a beautiful way of putting it. Yeah, every moment of being spoken to instead of talked about. I love that. Yeah, I very often find that people talk about children when they're there in a way that is very disrespectful. It's like, imagine if you were in an environment where people talked about you in front of you in a negative way. And we do it with children all the time. Oh, he's upset because he's hungry. Oh, he's upset. And we'll say things that we're kind of guessing about the child out loud. And, and adults do it all the time. They evaluate children publicly. They go, "Oh, look, he can't do this. Oh, it's," one of the most destructive things that parents will sometimes do when I'm seeing their child is they will speak for their child about something and create upset in the child. For example, I've had this a few times where I see a child and I go, "Hi, John, let's do this activity together," and the child's happy. And the parent will say out loud in front of the child, "Oh, John doesn't like doctors." And now I'm not a doctor, I'm not a physician, but John immediately thinks he's a doctor. "I don't like doctors," because parent just said that. And now that child who was happy and willing to cooperate with me isn't cooperating anymore, right? So, as a side note, be very careful, first of all, what you say around your child, and, be careful about describing what your child is thinking in front of them. It's kind of like, if imagine if you were upset about something and you were trying to vocalize your opinions, and someone else is there and they're like, "Oh, she's emotional because she's hungry." Like, imagine that. Like, you'd want to smack that person in the face. We hate those people, but we do it with children all the time. I read a great article. This was probably about 3 years ago and it was titled something like, "If we spoke to adults the way," like, if it was titled something like, "If someone spoke to you the way we speak to children, you would hate that person," right? And I just thought that was such an important point. I have 2 questions here. One from Diana, who's asking in Spanish. And interesting. Oh, I got 2 questions from Diana. Yeah, about is equine therapy, so basically, therapy with horses, helpful for kids? So, Deanna, I'll kind of answer this in a way, also talking about other therapies with animals. There's also dolphin therapy, and there are other therapies that involve animals. And the first thing I'll say, I love animals. I have a dog. My dog is one of my most beloved individuals in the world. So I always view animals in a positive light. I think animals being around people is great. That being said, I have not seen incredibly impressive results from equine therapy or dolphin therapy from parents who I've spoken to. And by the way, I love animals so much. If I felt it was even like remotely helpful, I would include it in the Doman program because I would want to spend more time with horses and dolphins and dogs. But I just haven't seen that. And this dates back many, many years. I mean, even as far back as my grandfather, there were different, animal therapies, and they just don't get impressive results. Now, that being said, if we look at like children and specifically with horses, I think that, sometimes the children care for the horses. So there might be some responsibility involved of, they're feeding the horse, or maybe they're helping clean something. And okay, so there can be practical things there. And also there is, when you have to sit on the horse, there's you have to control your balance. So I'm not saying that it's bad to ride horses. I think it's wonderful to ride horses. What I'm saying is I don't think that necessarily the time and expense that a lot of parents put into animal therapies is worth the results, that children could receive that stimulation elsewhere. And it's not necessarily something that you have to pay a lot of money for, that isn't going to get, the kind of changes in brain development, because in the end, it's really about changing the brain that is needed for a child. And so for that reason, we don't recommend it. That being said, if a parent ever asks me, hey, should we get a pet dog? I'm like, yeah, go ahead, because I I love pets. As long as the child isn't allergic, of course. All right. Let's see what else we've got here. Oh, Sandra is asking, should the program, basically the Doman Method program, which is given to a family, should it change in 6 months? Could it take longer or a year to develop the program for parents and children? So for parents who don't know, when families come to our clinic for the first time, I see we're over time, by the way. I'm having so much fun, I didn't even realize. So I'll answer this question and then we'll end off. So when parents come to the Doman International Clinic, they come for their first appointment. We evaluate the child and we give a 6-month program. And then after 6 months, the family returns, we reevaluate the child, and hopefully the child has made very good changes, and we create a new program. So Sandra, the reason why we recommend every 6 months is we find 6 months is enough time for the child to make major gains, but it's not too much time that the program starts to get kind of, old and stale. Like children need change, right? If it's the same thing every day for years, they tend to grow bored. And also, if you do the same treatment every day, year after year, there is going to be diminishing returns, right? And so adding new programs is a great way to get additional brain development. So to answer your question, 6 months is ideal. Okay. And so that's why I would say to a family, if a family felt 6 months wasn't possible for them, I'd say, okay, talk about it with your staff coach, whoever your contact is at Doman International, talk about it, find the perfect amount of time. But generally 6 months is best. Colleen, anything else you want to add before we sign off?
Just Happy New Year to everyone. We are registering for appointments throughout the first part of the year, and they're filling up. Everyone gets excited at the beginning of the year. So if you are considering coming to work with us this year, then please get in touch with me ASAP so that we can figure out the best time for you and you don't miss a window.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Colleen. Oh, Colleen, can you share your contact info for anyone?
Absolutely, yeah. So you all can always direct message us through any of our social media channels. I see all of those messages, or you can contact me directly. My number is country code 1-814-232 8668. And my direct email is info, I-N-F-O, @domaninternational.org.
Perfect. I just threw it up on the screen.
Perfect.
All right. Well, thank you for everyone for sticking with me. I really enjoyed this conversation. That's why it went long. And we'll be back next week. So we'll see you here at the same time. Thanks so much, Colleen.
You bet. Thank you.
Bye,
Bye-bye.
everyone.